Good night, everyone, and welcome to Globespan 24x7. I am Asha Kissoon, member of the new movement and chairperson, welcoming you tonight as your moderator. Tonight, we have a very interesting show headed up for you, speaking about the legal matters post elections and current affairs. We have a beautiful lineup of some good professionals tonight and Guyana's influencer that will be joining us soon. So I'll start by introducing Mr. Timothy Jonas. He's the chairperson of a new United Guyana. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Asha. Nice to see you. I was hoping to take a break from Globespan, but I could not resist the subject. So I hope you have some questions lined up for us. The difficult ones for Sanjeev, who is going to join us soon, I hope.
Definitely. We'll have a great discussion tonight. Looking forward to having some viewer participation. Tonight, the show has been opened up so people will be able to call in at the end of the show with their questions, which is an improvement to the show. Sanjeev Datadin will be joining us very soon. He's having some technical difficulties. And also by the Guyanese Critic as Guyana's #1 influencer on social media. He will be with us. Oh, good night, Mr. Datadin. We have Sanjeev Datadin with us. He is a renowned lawyer in Guyana and a candidate for the People's Progressive Party Civic. Welcome, Sanjeev. Can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yes, we can. All right, gentlemen, I usually start off my shows by asking your opinions on the atmosphere, the political atmosphere in Guyana, according to your assessment right now. As there is a transition going on into a new government and a new opposition, what's the feel of the population right now? Can we start with you, Tim, because you were here earlier?
I think there's been a totally different response from the supporters of the two different parties. Of course, the PPP supporters are absolutely relieved, thrilled, vindicated. So they haven't been as triumphant as we saw 5 years ago. I think credit has to be given there. The language and the tone of President Ali and his cabinet and his supporters has been very careful, very moderate, and you see definite attempts at inclusionary language, which is exactly what was needed. They say actions speak louder than words, and maybe some of the actions have not been entirely inclusionary, but I don't say that as a criticism, because when you have a changeover, you need to make some changes. And although I may not agree with all the changes, some certainly needed to be made, and I think we can expect more. From the APNU side, everything looks to be in tatters. President Granger seems to be on his way out, but the legacy which he has left is not one of a strong, united party. His supporters have turned on him. His most ardent and virulent supporters of electoral fraud are disappointed that he did not take a strong arm approach and push that fraud all the way through to the end, and they feel betrayed. The irony is enormous, but we are seeing hardliners who have turned on him because he's weak, and in that language, weakness means succumbing to democracy. So you have that, and then you have a transparent attempt to remove some of the old guard, to put in some new faces, but not a meaningful change. And I think that there's already been resistance, there's already been pushback, and we have to wait to see where that lands. At the end of the day, APNU represents nearly half of this country in terms of political support base. They have to land on their feet, and they have to move forward and pick up the pieces that have been left from a disastrous campaign. So the mood is completely different in the two camps. What is fortunate is that everyone is so tired and fed up that we just wanted to get back to our lives, get back to work, and most of us are glad simply to do that.
Yes, well said, Tim, because I also noticed the same approaches. But I realized that as of recent, when I've been among the general population, that I've seen people, there's more synergy now. The transition, in my opinion, has been gaining some momentum. There isn't the traditional fight that we saw during the election time when there was the animosity and the high peak of the racism. Mr. Datadin, what's your opinion of the current political atmosphere? How are the people's reaction towards this transition of the new government, in your opinion?
I agree with a lot of what Timothy said. There is obviously two sides. There, the People's Progressive Party are, of course, happy that the process is over, happy that the will of the people has been reflected. That is reflected in the vote is now what the government represents. But there is indeed now the quarrel that is going on within the appears to be going on at least within the PNC or the APNU AFC. For example, you see the determination now that that has been said that if you don't have 7,000 members, you can't get a seat in parliament for all the small parties that had formed that. But we had persons who were ministers of government from those parties before, and those persons were sitting in parliament. We have the situation where perhaps prominent members or members that are in the executive of the PNC are also not included in the government. The former Attorney General appears not to be one that has been considered favorably. And we see the same sort of, I would hate to say that it's the same sort of evasive answers that mean nothing, but we see the same sort of answers and from Mr. Granger, where he is saying these things, but it's now turned to his own party. And they're going to have to figure out and have a way of dealing with it. The transition process that has been going on has obviously involved the appointment of persons. There is, of course, in the political sphere, a lot of that to be done. It's been moving apace. It doesn't quite seem to have the constant media updates as we would have during the election time, but it's obviously a different environment, and it's moving apace. And I understand that several of the major issues are being addressed, and it's only been a little bit more than 2 weeks. Actually, it's been 2 weeks and 2 days. So it's a time that we wait and see.
All right, thank you very much. So, gentlemen, let's jump right into it. The much awaited election petition. So, seeing that I have two great legal minds with me tonight, we have seen a delay in the election petition that was their broken tune throughout the recount process. That's amidst their attempts to stop the recount altogether. So we've seen that it's not been filed as yet. But legally speaking, can you explain to the viewers if this election petition would have any ground? Is there enough evidence for it to go forward? What's your opinion on that? Can we start, Tim, please?
Oh, there's lots of evidence. I'm just not sure that all the evidence is favorable to the party who will need to bring the elections petition. And I think that's the danger, and that's where they're hamstrung. You see, an election petition doesn't necessarily go one way. Yes, the loser is aggrieved or pretends to be aggrieved and files something saying, I was robbed, I was robbed. He holds up signs and he protests, I was robbed. But this cuts two ways. And when an independent court sits down to look at the evidence, the beauty of a fair hearing is that you don't just hear one side, you hear both. And in this case, if you are to hear both sides, there is compelling and damning evidence about fraud. And the damning evidence includes members of the GCOM Secretariat, and it shows clear complicity by members of the GCOM Secretariat in fraud in an attempt to favor APNU. Now, the sleights of hand that we have seen, dead overseas voters, documents missing from boxes, and that kind of thing, responsibility for that traces back to that same GCOM secretariat. So you have the danger that you may necessarily, in pretending that you are aggrieved by an election result, have to attack the secretariat that has really gone out of its way to try to keep you in office. And this dangerous thing about litigation is that documents can be ordered to be produced by the court. SOPs can be ordered to be produced. You can ask for discovery to find out about procedures. So what are the procedures for the security and the maintenance of security of documents? When those SOPs were in the Ashman's building, whose responsibility was it to maintain them secure? Where did they go? When the spreadsheet that there's video evidence of Mingo calling a broadsheet to which you referred to, when that is relied on, well, how was that spreadsheet prepared? Who inputted the numbers? Where did they get the information from? By the time you start asking those questions, a lot of people need to be very worried. So yes, there's a lot of evidence, but which direction the evidence points, and given that there's no control by one party or another over court proceedings, and those court proceedings will be public and will be subject to appeal all the way up to the top, I wonder if it is feasible to file an elections petition. We'll see.
Thank you very much. Mr. Datadin, what's your opinion? This is the most talked about thing right now because everybody is asking the question, why isn't this election petition filed as yet? What's your take on it?
Well, you see, I have said many times, and I'll say it again. As far as I am aware, no one in the history of planet Earth has ever filed an election petition to be declared the loser of an election. And the only way for you to have or the ability to file an election petition will mean that you will have to produce your documents that showed that you won. That's the step one. You then have to find witnesses and evidence that show that the result that has been declared is not accurate. And it is inaccurate to the point where so much votes of yours are not counted that if you had counted them, or accounted for them would be the right term, that the results would be numerically different. Now, on the first limb, I am not sure that they would be willing to produce these much talked about SOPs. We heard at one time that it was being saved for that occasion, that when court proceedings would come, because that was a matter of strategy. But I would sincerely like to see them still, and I would like to sincerely have an explanation from the leadership of that party when they had those SOPs in their possession, why they proceeded to say that they had won the election, and why they proceeded to accept the vote counts that were coming from especially Mr. Mingo. Now, if that were so, and they did say publicly that their numbers matched Mingo's numbers, I would be curious to see from which document they lifted those numbers to be able to have them. But as Timothy has pointed out, what they will have to do is they will have to attack GCOM, which was making the staff of the Secretariat was making no small effort to keep them in power. So the same people who were the ones that were trying to keep them in power will now have to be the ones that they turn their swords to. And those are the same people that the whole country has been saying, why wouldn't they simply have done their job? As you would recall, on the 2nd of August, when things changed and unfolded, it all took place within a space of about under 2 hours. Mr. Lowenfield submitted a report. The chairwoman received the report, presented it to GCOM. They had decided to accept it. They declared it. and a swearing-in ceremony took place. Now, in the circumstances of this matter, they have 28 days, or the 28 days that they had, so there's still time. We had heard and we had seen from their usual operatives say that it would have been filed yesterday, which was Monday, that it was being worked on over the weekend. That has also not happened. We are simply going to wait the remaining days to find out whether an election petition will now be filed. But my curiosity would be, what would be the evidence that they intend to present to the court? Because unlike what they can do on social media and television programs, and at the time, newspapers that were under their control, what they could say then on pure rhetoric and on pure simple, whatever they're saying is their position of logic, they can't simply do that now. They have to justify it and they have to produce evidence. And I, out of pure curiosity, I would dearly like to see what evidence they wish to produce to the court. But I wouldn't hold my breath about the petition being done. I really wouldn't hold my breath.
Thank you very much. I think the whole of Guyana, myself included, are very desperate to see these SOPs now. And there's damning evidence that should be put forward by the party filing the election petition. You mentioned Lowenfield there, and that would bring me to the next case that is the most talked about case right now, taking Lowenfield to court. It was taken by Dr. Josh Kanai from the New Movement and Mr. Moriam also. So according to my understanding, the case is now in the DPP's hands. Can you enlighten the viewers a bit about the case? Can we start with you, Mr. Datadin?
I wouldn't go into too much detail because I'm one of the attorneys that's prosecuting in these proceedings. But I will tell you what happened. The charges were indeed filed. When those charges were filed, Mr. Nigel Hughes, who represents Mr. Lowenfield, one of his attorneys, he wrote a letter to the DPP requesting that the matter be dismissed after the election results were declared. The DPP then wrote to the attorneys who were representing the various virtual complainants, which are the complainants in the matter. The reason why that was so is these are what are known as private criminal proceedings. During all of 5 months and the mayhem that was going on, essentially, the actions that were being done and the activities of Mr. Lowenfield and Mr. Mingo, the police were not doing anything actively about investigating or whether or not criminal offenses were being perpetrated, as a result of which private criminal proceedings were filed. The DPP has the right at any stage of proceedings to intervene. Now, what she did is she intervened and she asked us for our papers because she wants to have a look at what we're doing. I see that in some sections of the media that was taken to mean that she would take it over and discontinue the proceedings. I don't think that that's a realistic hope or a realistic possibility in the circumstances. But she does have a right, and my understanding is she has asked for our papers and she has asked for what it was because she intended to respond to Mr. Hughes, who wrote to ask her to continue the proceedings. So I believe that what she wants to have an idea of is what was all the evidence had in her position and what were all the things had, and would like to be able to respond to that. As it stands now, she is in charge of the proceedings, and it's going to go forward. The evidence, the offenses are 2 offenses essentially. One is fraud, one is misconduct in public office. The misconduct charge really stems from a very simple thing. If you're a public officer and you have a duty, usually set out in a statute or a regulation somewhere, that says that you must do something, and you do not do so in a manner that is inimical to the public interest, then that would amount to misconduct in public office. And if we were to take the example of what is going on, as a public officer, Mr. Lowenfield was obliged to tabulate the recount votes and deliver that to the chairman of GCOM. And what he did is he did not do that. And what was inimical to the interests of the public is he declared a party to be the winner of the elections on more than one occasion that was in fact not the person who represented the winner, the will of the people. So in what was inimical to the public interest was the undermining of democratic rights, obviously, and the undermining of the will of the people. So that would be it. The fraud would be for all the things Mr. Jonas had pointed out in your earlier thing about, as it relates to an elections petition. You have to show proof of what it is, and you can't be a public official who pull numbers out of a hat continuously and say that these are the numbers that reflect the will of the people. It's fraudulent to do that. And so those are what are concerning. And I'm sure that anybody...
Thank you very much, Mr. Datadin, for clearing that up. It gave me also a better understanding of the legalities associated with the case. Mr. Jonas, we had 4 sets of numbers declared by Lowenfield. At one point, we were comparing them. We made graphs. We had a lot of fun trying to decide where he got the numbers from, which is the truth. The different parties coming together, standing up for democracy. In relation to taking Mr. Lowenfield to court and holding people in charge of our democracy responsible, what's your take on the case and the fact that somebody's standing up to him and holding him accountable?
I have a more restrictive point of view than Sanjeev about the DPP's powers to take over a privately prosecuted case and withdraw it. I have had a fight with this DPP before on the same subject. I can tell you the story. Back in 2004, 2005, I represented a gentleman who worked at Gaiwa and had been fired by the then head of Gaiwa, Karen Singh, in circumstances that we felt were unlawful, and his salary had been withheld. So I represented him and sued for the salary, but I also filed private criminal charges against the head of Gaiwa for withholding the salary, which is a criminal offense under the Labor Act. And I was notified that that gentleman had, through counsel, contacted the DPP, who took over my prosecution and withdrew it.
It wasn't counsel, Timothy, I can assure you that. It was
so
not true.
I filed proceedings in court to set aside the decision of the DPP and to quash it. And I argued before Justice Rishi Prasad, who's now Court of Appeal judge, that the discretion that the DPP has to either prosecute a case or to take away the prosecution of a case, to withdraw the prosecution of a case, although technically it appears, she needs to be very careful in how she decides to take away the prosecution, because that is subject to corruption. You see, if I prosecute you criminally, the magistrate is the entity, or the judge is the entity, who has the power to hear the evidence, adjudicate, and decide if you're innocent or guilty. That is where it should be decided, not anywhere else, and certainly not by the DPP, who receives a phone call from a named defendant or a counsel for a named defendant or a letter by a party who is interested, and she decides to play judge and withdraw your case. That has to be very, very carefully done. And in that case, it was Peters, application by Peters. In that case, Justice Prasad agreed, and he set aside the DPP's decision to withdraw my prosecution, and my prosecution continued. So I am surprised that the DPP has not already responded, because what is already in the public domain is more than sufficient for the DPP to decide a magistrate who is authorized by law to hear the criminal proceedings, to take the evidence, to subject it to cross-examination, and to decide guilt or innocence. That magistrate is the better person to decide guilt or innocence, not the DPP sitting in her private office, subject to scrutiny by nobody. And if she makes a decision on this that is adverse, I will hopefully be able to persuade my good friend Datadin that he needs to take proceedings to quash any decision that she makes to that extent.
No, you're preaching to the choir. I am totally of the view that the discretion to take over and discontinue is entirely different to the discretion to charge. And I believe since that time of Peters, where I had been at the time I was the attorney for the gentleman. So that's why I tell you it wasn't the attorney who contacted the DPP. But the time as the situation exists, the law from the time Peters was decided to now is far advanced as to public discretion and what public officials can do. And
yes.
Public officials cannot interfere with private citizens' rights unless there's attendant reasonableness, there is all the various public law principles are applied. So, but about the people who stood up, I know them, the two individuals. Perhaps I know some, Josh a little bit more, Dr. Kanai a little bit more than I know the other gentleman. But you see how things work, and this is something I've said before. Society's democracy, it only works, all that it takes is one man to stand up. There have been so many instances where we always believe that we don't have a whole huge following behind us. And as a result, we should do nothing. And we should tolerate what is going on, or we should stand up. Guyana, if Guyana has learned anything from this election cycle and this entire process, is there were many instances of one solitary man making a difference. I mean, not that it was in the election itself, but it all began with one man in the parliament with the no confidence vote. It was one man who decided to vote a particular way, that he had no confidence in the government, that brought the government down. And variously over the 5 months that we were going through this never-ending nightmare, which appeared to be at the time, there were so many people who stood up in little pockets. But what started to happen after a while is there were so many people who were standing up in their own way and in their own effort that it became untenable at one time. And in the end, it was pretty much impossible for the rigging of the election to take place. It was so exposed in so many facets, so many mediums, social media, the newspapers, the television. It was everywhere, even in international media. That that was to a great help to the democratic process.
Yes, thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Jonas, I can see that you have a response there. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm glad to hear Sanjeev so enthusiastically endorsing the idea that when someone is prosecuted, it is really for the adjudicating judge or magistrate to decide their guilt or innocence, either to convict them or to vindicate them. Because I have no doubt that you will be raising later the question of the withdrawal of the charges against President Ali. And I think the same principles apply. And I'm curious to see if there's a different point of view that is expressed in that regard.
Well, yes, that was my next question. We've seen His Excellency Dr. Irfan Ali being cleared of all charges So Tim, seeing that you brought it up, can we start with you? What's your take on that? We've had half of the population celebrating that our president has been cleared of all charges, and we have had another half of the population crying out that justice has been shunned aside. Legally, what's your opinion on that?
I think that what Sanjeev has said resonates and is true and needs to be understood. It's time that Guyanese stop thinking about their side and the other side and start looking at the system to see how the system works, how the system should work, and how we can fix the system to avoid abuse. Because whether you like the person who's in charge or whether you hate the person who's in charge, you can't close your eyes and blindly let that person make all the decisions. We all have feet of clay. And if you appoint somebody there and pretend that they're God, they're going to abuse that God-like position that you've given them. Now, because we resolutely ignore that principle in Guyana, that the system needs to be transparent and the system needs to protect us against abuse by our leaders, we take this thing so easily when the system is circumvented or abused. And we see that the same police force that on the same recommendation by that same DPP decided to initiate charges against President Ali, that same police force, with no explanation, withdraws, and the charges are therefore dismissed by the presiding magistrate. So what changed? What was different? The only thing that was different is that when the gentleman was not president, when he was in the opposition, the police made one decision, and then as soon as he got into power, you have the opposite decision made. So the only variable is who's in power, who's got political control. That cannot be right. It cannot be right. And in fact, it is unlawful. So it's not just morally wrong, it's not just morally disgraceful, it's unlawful. And none of this goes back to President Ali. You see, when the charges were initiated against President Ali, they smelled bad. I'm not advocating for the gentleman. I'm not saying that he was innocent. In fact, I don't believe that he did his job and came out of there pure as the driven snow. I don't know if he's guilty of any of those 19 charges. But in my view, there was a political element and a political motivation to the institution of those 19 charges on the recommendation of this DPP. That is well and good. But as we said before, and as applies to Mr. Lowenfield, the charges having been brought, a magistrate needs to hear the evidence and adjudicate and decide guilty or innocent. And if President Ali is innocent, he needs to have the satisfaction of facing the whole country and saying to the country, there, magistrates say I'm not guilty. All of you detractors can go to hell. I have been proved innocent. But we've had a corruption of the process. So that when charges are implemented against the gentleman, whether the charges smell right or not, whether they're politically motivated or not, what we know for sure is that when they're withdrawn because he's president, that was politically motivated. And in fact, the Constitution says that where there are existing proceedings, they shall not be continued. They need to be stayed. Because, of course, if you have a police force that withdraws a charge against a sitting president, that smells just as bad as the charges that were implemented under a previous regime. No one knows guilt or innocence now, but what we do know is that politics played a part, not just in the withdrawing of the charges, but of the implementation. And the Constitution says that that legal proceeding should have been stayed. It should not have continued during his presidency, but it should have been stayed so that it could be continued and a vindication take place after his presidency expires. So what happened was wrong. What happened was tainted politically. What happened was immoral. And what happened is an example of the horrible system that we have allowed to evolve because of our blind party loyalty, one side or the other.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jonas. Some very strong opinions. You know, there's that old saying, innocent until proven guilty. Mr. Datadin, what's your take on the dismissal of the 19 fraud charges?
I agree with what Mr. Jonas is saying insofar as what he's saying is that what you should do is you should always have an adjudication of matters that come before the court. But here the challenges that you have. You can't, because of what the Constitution says about immunity, you can't have a sitting president before the court because he is immune from suit. So there is that can't happen. Now, the two other things that Mr. Jonas mentions are, the first thing is that you should stay the proceedings until such time as perhaps he may no longer be president, and then you can continue those proceedings. But there are two things that militate against that. Magistrates are not allowed to put matters down sine die, because as a matter of statutory power, under their statute, they must adjourn to a fixed and known date. So when exactly would the adjourn date be to? And secondly, we now have a whole body of law that has developed with great force that the fair trial within a reasonable time must take place. So if we were to say, for argument's sake, that you will set it to a date 5 years forward in 2025, because you can't set it down sine die, that would be 5 years before you conduct that trial. Now, if perchance President Ali were to win a second term, then it would have to be 10 years into the future. Now, the fair trial within a reasonable time guarantee would be that you have to be tried within a reasonable time. I think there is sufficient case law that by no stretch of the imagination is 10 years a reasonable time, nor in fact is 5. So the challenge that you have is, do you continue the proceedings, bearing in mind that you cannot try the person, 1. 2, you can't adjourn it, sine die, or to a date that is so far into the future that 2 other constitutional provisions would be maintained. Now, I understand what Mr. Jonas is saying, that Mr. Ali would benefit from the fact that he would stand in front of the court and say, well, look, I have not been convicted of these proceedings. And that, like Mr. Jonas, there was the feeling, at least as far as I'm concerned, that the charges were politically tainted in the first place. But the problem is, how would a prosecution take place in the circumstances of how our judicial system is? And that's the only way that the prosecution can indeed take place. It has to be based on the fact that you could try the person that you have in the court, and it has to be that you could do it within a reasonable time. Neither of those two things have been circled. If it weren't reasonable, then the DPP's exercise discretion are different, as if it were any other person to which the trial can go on and to which things can move on. So I believe they were related to the President Ali. I tried court.
Thank you very much, Mr. Datadin. Timothy, I can see that you have a response. Please go ahead. Before you start, let me welcome the Critic. He is Guyana's #1 social media influencer that we have. Welcome, Critic. We're having a discussion on the legal cases right now, speaking about President Irfan Ali's fraud charges being dismissed. I would ask that gentlemen please mute your microphones when you're not speaking so that we will not have any feedback. Ms. Jonas, please go ahead.
Sure. Welcome, Critic.
Thanks for having me, Asha.
When Sanjeev was talking there, he was throwing well-known legal sound bites at us. and it sounded very plausible and very nice, and it was done in good tones, and it was reminiscent of the very reasonable argument that somebody made a few months ago that 65 divided by 2 is 34. Let me answer the 3 points that he raised. First, he essentially said 3 things. He said, delay defeats justice. That resonated with everybody, made sense. But the fact is that Article 182 of the Constitution specifically contemplates that. You see, you got somebody who might have committed a crime and then is elected president. And indeed, you can't have him worried about being prosecuted while he's president. So Article 182 says you can't start criminal proceedings or continue criminal proceedings against him for the time he's president. All of that makes sense. But the article also says that time does not count against your prosecution. So for the time that he is president, you don't count that time. And therefore, the article expressly deals with that whole concept of delay defeats justice. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say we can't prosecute the president for the 5 years he's in office, but I'm sorry, you hearing me, Asha?
Yes, I am. Please continue. Sorry.
Yes, you can't say we can't prosecute the president for the 5 years he's in office, but because delay defeats justice, we then can't prosecute him afterwards when we know full well he may have committed a crime before he got into office. You can't have it both ways. And the Constitution specifically says time doesn't run for that purpose. So that delay defeating it doesn't make sense to me. The second one, that the magistrate can't adjourn sine die. That means without a specific date. She can't just adjourn until such time as he's no longer president. She has to fix a specific date. We've gone ad nauseum about mandatory and directory legislation. Everybody knows the difference now, whether you set a time frame, if that's mandatory or if you can, stretch the rules a bit. The magistrate doesn't even have to call the matter because the matter cannot continue while he is president. But we're not dealing with a magistrate adjourning or not calling the matter. We're dealing with the police deciding to withdraw the matter. And that is what is dangerous. And then the third thing Sanjeev talked about was the impracticability. The fact that it might be difficult to get the evidence after 5 years or 10 years. But the reality is you can have a vote of no confidence next week. So it might be 5 years or 10 years. It might be anytime soon. But the fact that it is practically difficult or the evidence may be lost, or if the evidence isn't lost, the memory of witnesses might become weaker. That is something that you can deal with and accommodate. But what you must not do, what you must never do, is allow a situation to permeate where when someone gets political power, the police withdraw the charge. The same police who, on the advice of the DPP, instituted the charge in the first place. Because that smells bad. It smells of executive arbitrariness and executive control of the police. It smells of executive control of the prosecution. It doesn't look right, and it is against the Constitution. We have to look at our systems. And our system does not permit any attempt by an executive to control the judges, to control the criminal proceedings. It says the matter must not continue while he is president, and therefore it must be held pending until it is over. That is what fairness is about.
Mr. Jonas, let me step right in. Were you getting the same smell under the previous administration when charges that most people never heard about were brought against Dr. Irfan Ali? Was there the same smell?
Critic, it's good to have you on. The sad thing about you this time is you came late, and you came just in time to miss the fact that one of the very specific things I said was that the implementation of those charges was under a different regime, a previous regime, when President Ali was in the opposition, and it smelled bad, and it looked bad. So we covered that ground already, Critic.
Okay, sir, sorry, but I got to remind people that I'm a sharpshooter, and I want, the really don't get away with anything. Thanks for having me, by the way.
It is a pleasure to have you, Critic.
Let me bring you up to what we have been discussing.
It's good to see you, Critic, but Dr. Kissoon, what I wanted to say is this.
Sure,
I understand what Tim is saying about about the time doesn't count. But it might be that, at least the interpretation that I had about the time don't count, is there are a lot of offenses and there are a lot of matters that have statutes of limitations to them. And it would mean that the limitation period for you to bring the proceedings or those things would not count. But you can't stop time counting from the reverse, ever, because the right of a litigant, the right of a person charged with an offense, you can't stop time for counting. Because the whole principle about what delay is, even if the delays were because you were filing appeals to every known part of it under the sun, and there's been a few cases where that has been raised, it's still the job that you have to go ahead with the prosecution. And if you're not in a position to go ahead with the prosecution, then there could be no other alternative. But I don't want to go to a back and forth, but I was just saying that I think the limitation really relates to the time about bringing or the proceedings as far as time counts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Datadin. You know, while both of you are speaking, the words honesty, decency, and integrity came to mind. And unfortunately, because of the previous campaign, when we hear those words now, we think negatively instead of positively. I myself ran as a presidential candidate, and to give my personal opinion on this, I would try my utmost best to clear my name, regardless of what happened if I was charged for anything, for the sake of putting to rest in the minds of all the people of Guyana that I'm innocent. That's just my 2 cents. Guyanese Critic, welcome. So far, we have discussed the election petition that has not been filed. We spoke about the case against Lowenfield and the 19 fraud charges. That's the discussion so far. So I invite you as a co-moderator to join in and bring in some of your own intakes and questions right now.
Well, I was listening to you guys earlier about the fraud charges. And what I want to ask Timothy and Sanjeev, and you could go one after the other in terms, because you obviously have different point of views on most things, although you're guided by law as to what you're discussing. We saw clearly that electoral fraud was committed. It's clear as day. The world witnessed it to the point that the Americans brought sanctions against specific persons who they could have identified from outside of this country. Do you think something is wrong? Mingo is not before the court. Lowenfield, I once heard Barrett Jagdeo, who's now vice president, say that this kind of electoral fraud attracts life imprisonment. If found guilty, obviously you gotta be proven guilty first. You're innocent until then. But we all saw what transpired. It's clear as day. This is not your regular court case, whereas this proof has to be brought up. You got to put forward the evidence. Everybody saw. The private prosecutors now have to make sure the evidence is presented and justice is served. Do you think the judicial system is a little lackadaisical in light of what transpired? Because if you catch a man with a giant, he'd have to remand. If a man murder, he's on remand. And you got Lowenfield walking about the place, driving about in a Lexus, Mingo, yes, and having a ball at the office up where he works, and where he worked before the election. Then he went back and worked after he committed a fraud, electoral fraud. Do you guys think that the judicial system is lacking somewhere? Do we have to address something? Is something wrong? This is the most heinous crime in recent times. And these two banner walking about the place, people making memes about them. You understand? We shouldn't be talking about these guys. and they should be getting tomorrow the issue that we discussing tomorrow in jail in the paper. Help me out there, guys.
Critic charged. Mingo has been, during the time when he was under protection, for those 5 months, police alleged that they couldn't find him. So, but as far as it goes, him being charged, Mingo was charged, and he's also before the court to appear at the same time. So, going to find out what happens with that in due course. But in terms of what you say about Lowenfield, look, the realities of those proceedings are that he's before the court. He's got to answer those charges. People, as much as it will irk people or irritate people that is, out at the moment, the reality is he's before the court and found guilty. He's entitled to be treated as if he were innocent, and he's entitled to enjoy his freedom. So it's not much that could be done as it relates to that part. But hopefully the charges against Mingo and I think it's Valda Lawrence, hopefully they get going soon enough, just as the ones with Lowenfield are going.
I think more than that. Of course, Sanjeev is right. I agree with everything he said, but Critic is becoming one of the more dangerous people in this country. He has a following, and he has a voice, and he has the charisma. And I worry sometimes that maybe in that position we have to be more careful as to where we direct our questions, because his question was something's wrong with our judicial system, something's wrong with our judiciary. But a judge can't leave the bench and walk down and grab Mingo by the ear and drag him to court to sentence him and lock him up. There's a process. The judge got to sit down and wait for somebody to prosecute him. So the problem, the perceived delay, certainly is not with the judiciary. It hasn't even gotten to the judiciary yet. The judge's job is to sit down and hear the prosecutor's case and hear the evidence and decide guilt or innocent. So the question really is, why is it taking so long for the prosecutors to put together the evidence to bring Mingo before the magistrate, to bring Lowenfield before the magistrate? That's really the question. So I wouldn't like us to treat this as a criticism of the judiciary or the judicial process. You have to put together your evidence, you have to file your charge, and then it gets before the judiciary, then it gets before the magistracy. So let's direct our attention at where the delay is now. And this is where I have a problem. You see, if you want to put together evidence of electoral fraud, you got to go right back to GCOM, to the GCOM Secretariat. You got to get their records. You got to find out who prepared that spreadsheet that Mingo relied on. You got to find out who it was that ducked the SOPs in GCOM's possession. So you have to go into the den of vipers to get that evidence that you need to rely on to present before a magistrate. And for me, as you say, these people are going at the end of the month back to GCOM and collecting their salaries. I have a problem with that. These people need to be dismissed because clearly the country and GCOM can have no confidence in their continuation in the conduct of their office. And when they are dismissed and therefore out of office, there needs to be a team of investigators who goes, examines GCOM's records, uncovers what is there, so as to put together the evidence that can be brought before a magistrate. And it bothers me that 2 weeks later that hasn't been done. It hasn't even been started. I want to know if everyone at GCOM is asleep. Because the longer we wait and the longer those same rotten apples go to work day after day, the more opportunity they have to make things disappear, the more opportunity they have to obfuscate. And that is where we should be directing our attention. The end of August is coming. Are they going to go and collect another monthly paycheck, or is GCOM going to do something about it? That is what I worry about.
Please unmute Guyanese Critic. Please press your unmute button. We can't hear you. At the bottom left corner of your screen.
Critic.
There.
Yeah.
Critic, for the first time in a long time, you're not dangerous.
So, Timothy, help me out here. When you say they, you know, these people, they're going back into the job at GCOM, and obviously that shouldn't be. Would that include retired Justice Carter Singh?
No, I'm referring to the GCOM Secretariat. The GCOM Secretariat are the officers employed within the organization who are behind the scenes, should be doing the work, but have been undermining the work. We have suspicions who they are, but we know that the people in the key places need to be removed from those key places, even if it's just to safeguard evidence. But for GCOM, for those 7 members of the commission, they have the power to hire and fire. And they have enough material before them. This has nothing to do with court, criminal proceedings, and all of that. This has to do with an employer who can say he has lost confidence in his employee and firing the employee. And they have more than enough material to take that step on several occasions with several of their officers. And I'm surprised they haven't done it yet. It needs to be done. It needs to be done urgently because the evidence is in GCOM and that evidence can disappear. But more than that, if we have a compromised secretariat that has gone rogue and nothing is done, we're going to have another elections. Are we going to wait 4.5 years before we think about cleaning that up, or are we going to clean house now? That's something to think about.
Timothy, if I remember correctly, the Commissioner of Police facilitated or played a role in electoral fraud. Claudette Singh made a request to the Commissioner of Police that facilitated electoral fraud. So why are we limited to staff of the Secretariat?
I'm not aware of that, Critic. I think you got to be more specific if you want to give an example.
Okay.
Because you've lost me there. I don't remember any.
PNCR campaign manager Joseph Harmon, Joe Harmon, made a request to chairwoman of GCOM, to find out about some names of persons who went abroad or in the diaspora and persons voted here for them. Fully well knowing that these were just allegations and the GCOM Secretariat has no authority to investigate. They ain't got the mechanism to investigate and sort of this. They're not a court to look at evidence. Madam Chairperson wrote to the Commissioner of Police, who happens to be the Chief Immigration Officer, who came back saying, yes, there were 172 persons on a list who were out of the country.
I think that that can be read 2 ways, and I don't see that it's sinister necessarily. You see, you are assuming that when GCOM, through the chairman, wrote to inquire if these people on this list were in the country or out of the country, that she was doing it for the purpose of disallowing votes or allowing votes. And nowhere in the correspondence, nowhere in the communication, and nowhere in her subsequent actions has she disallowed votes because of those allegations or because of responses from GCOM, from the Commissioner of Police. In fact, to follow the logic of what you're saying, she ought to have then disallowed the votes when he said these people were out of the country. She didn't. So clearly she had another motive, another intention. But look at it this way. If you're in charge, you are the CEO, You are the person in charge of the organization, and an allegation is made to you that some of your employees have been undertaking their duties fraudulently. Wouldn't you write to find out? Because I think it is entirely within GCOM's function to write to find out if there was wrongdoing by their employees, so that when the whole election mess is over and they've done their job, they can take action against those employees on the evidence of what is given to them. So not that they're trying to allow or disallow votes or it has anything to do with influencing the election, but to ensure the integrity of their process or to fire who needs to get fired. Isn't that a possibility and a possible motive for that exchange of correspondence with the immigration officer?
Well, very eloquently put, but do not
Gentlemen,
forget.
second, please. We have to go on a short break. And when we get back, I'll ask Mr. Datadin to give his proposed solution to the problem that we had just now. So let's go to a break, then we'll continue because we had put it off a while now.
Globespan 24x7.
Take the family or maybe go with friends on a train getaway to Boston and Cape Cod. Explore Boston City with a multi-day hop-on hop-off bus tour where you can immerse yourself in its rich history and New England charm. Then take the Provincetown ferry over to Cape Cod. The quaint villages, serene beaches, and renowned seafood restaurants will make you never want to leave. This Boston and Cape Cod package includes round-trip coach tickets to Boston, the Provincetown ferry, and 3 nights hotel accommodation. So book Boston and Cape Cod with Travelspan. It has something for everyone. Call Travelspan to book at 718-845-0437. That's 718-845-0437. And book your Boston and Cape Cod train getaway today.
Welcome back, everyone. We're having a very heated discussion about the legalities and electoral fraud. So when we went on a break, Mr. Timothy was explaining to us the intricate technicalities on staff and firing and what was happening. Mr. Datadin, on the way forward, we know all the atrocities that have happened. There are several court cases that are ongoing. What would be your suggestion as a solution to make sure something like that never happens again?
We got to have reform. We got to have a reform of the laws. We got to have reform of the Constitution in regards. And we definitely need to have, I know from the last administration, Commission of Inquiry really has a negative connotation, but there must be an inquiry as to what happened to GCOM, because it is important that the nation understand who did what and why. Now, as Critic was saying, that there are several persons who have questions to answer. And the nation deserves to know why what those answers are. But we certainly must change our laws. We cannot have a situation anymore where we have two people who are members of the secretary, Mingo and who took it upon themselves during an election to change the result. And we spent, as I understand, if from the newspapers, we spent $8.7 billion to make sure that everybody can vote in a fair and transparent. $8.7 billion and all the laws and constitution in the world. And two men decided, well, you could hold that. I call in these numbers out, and this is who you got to swear in as. Can you imagine that that's what transpired in Guyana? And that held up an entire nation for 5 months. Now, you got to look at the realities of it. There must be consequences when persons in the Secretariat of GCOM take it upon themselves not only to break the law with impunity and to declare who they want as winners. We've got to implement serious penalties for that. But more importantly, we've got to legislate a way to stop it. That when it's so obvious, you don't have to sit and wait and be. I mean, we've had this discussion. I know myself and Mr. Jonas has on various occasions, and myself and Critic has on various occasions. And the constant question that everybody spoke about, do you believe he can do the right thing? Do you believe he can do the right thing today? I believe he can do the right thing, or no, that man can do the right thing. That was the constant conversation. How is it we have descended to hold an entire nation hostage upon a determination whether one single man will choose to obey the law and quote unquote do the right thing? That can't be anymore. Our laws have got to have more teeth. Do you know that in the last election for District 4, Region 4, every political party except APNO asked for a recount of Region 4. And for one reason or another, all the parties were misled by Mingo as to whether they had a counting agent, which was a specific officer on the statute. All had the same explanation. He contacted them the day before and he told them, tell me who's your counting agent and it will be okay. And then when they asked to recount, he says, you have no counting agent. An entire process was held hostage by one man who chose not to obey the law. The law says he must show a statement of polls. The judge ordered him to show the statement of polls. He decided no. We cannot have a system that is like that anymore. We cannot do that. When those blatant breaches are taking place, there must be a mechanism for intervention and for reasonable, sensible people to direct what should happen and for it. And this was not rocket science. Everybody added the recount on their fingers and toes if necessary while it was going on. Everybody knew what the figures were. But we have to wait on one man to take a piece of paper to the chairwoman so that the chairwoman can then say, well, oh, you know what? This is what it is. That can't be. We've got to change our laws. We've got to hold those who are accountable. We've got to do a commission inquiry into GCOM, and we've got to examine in that commission of inquiry what exactly how were they able to do it? Why were they able to do it? And how we make sure they never do it again. Those are the things that happen.
Sanjeev, let me tell you, right? And just before we came on, let me let the viewers know, Timothy was telling me, "Boy, don't say nothing that's going to be libelous." Well, let me tell you, because it doesn't need a commission of inquiry to tell you why they do it. There was rigging the election in favor of the PNC. You understand? So they need a commission of inquiry because it's not me becoming president. It wasn't the party that Timothy is a part of would have won. It is the PNC. Now, again, we're supposed to say APNU, but if you look at what is transpiring politically in the PNC presently, you understand, where they give Uncle Sharma the boot, you realize is the PNC. If you go into history, you would realize these actions looked like actions similar of the past, where people so brutal, you understand, they come like thieves in the night and want thief for whole election. The PNC, and if you want to know where the PNC is, if you want we clarify the narrow down, they got a main office of Congress place in Sophia. So we gotta get commission of inquiry to figure out what happened and who are the players, right? Just to simplify it, and I know which liar they're gonna take, will come and say, I'm being libelous. I wait to see that one. Right? One question I want to ask, and I heard you guys talk about it earlier. The PNC can't bring a petition. You bring a petition when you feel what you bring in an election petition, from my understanding, and I stand to be corrected by you guys if I'm going out. An election petition is when you feel you right, dead center right. So it's either you lose fairly or you were robbed. So you go with an election petition. So in the event when you bring an election petition before the court and you find out that you weren't robbed, then you realize, buddy, you're dead center. You don't bring an election petition when you is the, I don't even know what to call it, you is the Kangalang. They rig the election. You don't bring an election petition when you bring a, when you're
the rigger, that was
when you're the rigger. So obviously they bring an election petition. Timothy, do you think one of the smaller parties, because if they don't bring an election petition, this evidence could be buried for a long time. Do you think one of the smaller parties should bring an election petition and let me get these SOPs and send these people, put the last couple of nails in the coffin, finally and forever and done with them? The PNC, I mean.
That's an interesting question. The thing is that, as you yourself just said, to file an election petition, you have to be satisfied that the elections were flawed. And at the end of the day, we've had a fair election, haven't we?
Yes.
So you're asking me to file an election petition for an ulterior motive. And that also undermines the system. I am going to preach this, and I'm going to be preaching it for the next 5 years. We have to have a system that withstands scrutiny, and then we have to follow the system. Every time we undermine the system, or we pretend we're following the system for some ulterior motive, we are defeating what we should be doing. The system is, you think you get robbed, you file an election petition. I can't file an election petition if I think the elections were fair, but I want GCOM produce the SOPs. I have to find another way that is fair and in accordance with the system to make GCOM produce those SOPs.
God, man, you little more could find a liar. Everybody could find a liar except the Guyanese critic. Everybody find a liar to do some of the most amazing things. Lawyers start doing trick. You understand? People go to the CCJ. Yeah, talk lie. People lie in front of the OASL, and I can't find a liar. No, I get put down. All right, buddy, I accept. I am guided by you guys. You understand? I accept.
Since you tonight, we're coming close to the closing of the show, but Critic, you're on the ground with the people. You've been interacting with the public a lot. We have seen APNU's new cabinet being assigned. And interesting enough, David Granger, Valdo Lawrence, Simona Brooms, some of the main players are not on the new parliamentary list. What's your take on that, Critic?
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Before I get into it, we saw what happened before the elections. What were the actions of the previous administration. We saw what transpired during the elections and then thereafter the elections. And one of the things I constantly say is a man can't do what he ain't know. You understand? That is why we aspire to learn continuously, learn. So when you look at a failed government, when you look that they fail, and they fail to see that they fail, so much so, they come to the table and decide, here up no, we ain't taking losses, we picking up the winnings. These is gamblers. You understand? What they didn't realize is the house does not lose. The house being democracy stands, right? So their dispensation, you got to remember, it's the same set of people. I think David Granger would have done the right thing, because what purpose is he going to serve? He is listed right now as one of the worst presidents ever. Before him was Donald Ramadar, right? I see him as the president. Now, Donald Ramadar moved up a notch. David Granger took over that position as one of the worst presidents. Now, why do I say that? Presidents should have likability, right? Nobody likes David Granger. David Granger got run out from Linden when he first went and was campaigning. What the PNC did is created an atmosphere that suggested that David Granger has honesty and he had integrity and he was a man of decency. What they did not explain to David Arthur Granger is that these are things that you have to be a part of. You have to act in a manner. It's not a badge. You just be honest today and dishonest tomorrow, like how he just be. He's come. His honesty, you don't see it. You understand? It's like a trick, it's constantly moving. Then he comes and lies and deceives his people, and then he disappears again. Then he comes back. Integrity, honesty, and decency are badges of honor you wear. And how do you wear them? By constantly acting in a certain manner. You understand? Imagine people from the diplomatic community decide to call the man a sanctimonious gangster. Nobody attaches the card Trump Rocket Man. Oh, let me call you a gangster. You imagine you have a head of state that somebody decides to add a word that makes it look interesting and important in front and gangster the back, sanctimonious gangster. So I feel it was the fitting thing for him to stand back and don't go into parliament, because he's an embarrassment to this nation. And when it's done, he says he's going to play, using the term the game. He's still in the game. This is a game. A man died at Bath Settlement. You understand? People have been in disarray for 5 months. It's a game. He ain't even politically savvy for figure out what terms to use to bring calm. So it is fitting that he is not there, Valda Lawrence is not there, and the other persons are not there. Now, what is worrying is not who in there, is who there. Them is the confusion pack. A man who run a program, the Lampy Pampy program on Fiction Network, he gonna turn a parliament if it cause more confusion. There needs a strong opposition. There needs a strong opposition presently. And when I look at them, I have no respect for them. And I am saying people like yourself, Asha, and Timothy have to take up the mantle, because there obviously needs replacement for this big junk that is considered to be opposition, that only really adds up to junk, mucus in someone's trachea, and needs to be gotten rid of.
Loud and clear, Guyanese. I actually consider the point that, seeing that these main players separated themselves from the parliamentary seats, it could be that they understand that they've lost a lot of traction and they're hoping to form something new on their own. We're yet to see if it's going to happen. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the show, so I'll ask each of you to give a closing statement. It could be some advice to the public. It could be something we didn't mention tonight that you'd like to bring up. Can we start with you, Tim, if that's okay?
Sure. I've deliberately stayed quiet for 2 weeks. I think people will realize they haven't heard from me or seen me for 2 weeks because our new government needs a chance to settle in, to get organized, and to start making decisions and moving forward. They need a grace period. Already, I believe that they are taking some decisions which show bad old habits. But what I would like to ask Guyanese to do and to think about is that it's all well and good to be on the outside criticizing. But I would like our conversation going into the future, not just to be pointing out the wrongs that have happened, for example, the withdrawal of the criminal charges, but also to see if we can make positive suggestions that are constructive and that may help. It's all well and good to criticize, but criticism without context and criticism without constructive suggestions is unhelpful. And what I will, for speaking for myself, will try to do going forward is I will try to temper criticisms with actual suggestions, recommendations, whether it's financial, whether it's taxation, whether it's social development, and see if we can persuade our government with the voice we have to implement some of them. And also, by trying to be supportive in that way, see if we can persuade the government to avoid some of the bad decisions that they're already making.
Thank you very much. Great input. Mr. Datadin, can we have your final remarks, please?
Like Mr. Jonas, I've been quiet for 2 weeks. I really haven't been saying or doing anything much because really and truly, I needed to get back to work, getting back to what I usually do. And been away from it for a long time. I am happy that I came on tonight. I swear I haven't had a laugh like this in the longest time that I can imagine. But I'm sure Mr. Jonas is going to refer to lawyers performing three-card tricks for a long time into the future. The imagery is exceptional, but I would say the same thing. A lot of what Tim said, but look, a lot of things have to go on. Transition is in the middle of it. I believe parliamentarians, within the PNC, appears that persons that were perceived to be leaders and persons who were very prominent in the last parliament are no longer in parliament. There has been an outcry by one of the Bond about what is taking place and whether or not that leads to a split or differentiation. Time will tell. I think it will. We've also seen that Mr. Granger has said that if you don't have 7,000 supporters, you can't have. The shame that didn't apply at 33 odd ministers in government, because everybody pretty much had a ministerial portfolio in that administration. That is not going to be the same thing for the PVP parliament. Not everybody who is going to parliament is going to be a minister. I believe the list, we're now ready to convene. We've been without parliamentary supervision since Charandas's vote, essentially, legitimate supervision at least. And a country requires a parliament oversight. That's where it starts. Ministerial accountabilities, the way the things are. As I understand, sides have given their list of parliamentarians, and we will hopefully convene parliament shortly.
Thank you very much. Guyanese Critic, would you like to give a closing remark to the...
Well, all I want to say, in all my harshness and crude methods, my intentions are to see unity and development in this country. The only problem I have is that how do you deal with thieves and thugs? A lot of which we've seen hiding as politicians in this country, right? So hence the method that I use. I ain't as eloquent as Sanjeev and Timothy. I ain't no liar, right? But I doing my thing and my way. Like I said, I did it my way when I'm done, right? But whatever it is, I want Guyanese to know and see the importance of us all working together. Even the PNC people that I was be very harsh on sometimes, we all have to work together to develop this country. And I am going to be here for a long time. And my intention is to work with anybody who wants to see development in this country. And I'm going to ask Timothy and yourself, Asha, to remember that the votes that you got is a hint from the people that they are people who have an interest in you people, and you need to keep forging forward, because that number of people who have an interest in you is obviously going to grow.
Thank you very much. Well, to my audience tonight, thank you very much for joining us. It was a very interesting show, very entertaining, very informative, especially on the legal matters. I would remind you and leave you with a little insight that please be reminded that myself and Mr. Jonas are opposition also. And like he said earlier, we intend to build. We're not about breaking down and slang talking and bad talking anybody. Of course, we will speak out if there's need to do so, but it's about getting forward, building Guyana, healing Guyana from all that has been ripped apart over the last 5 months plus that we went through. For the first time in history in the whole world. It's a sad situation that we had to make it to the Guinness Book of World Records for something so disastrous. But now let us focus on working together as a nation and building Guyana to the best Guyana it has ever been. So thank you once again, gentlemen, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Asha. Critic.
Asha.
Pleasure. Thank you.